All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we are going to talk about the explanation from President Oaks on the recent support of the church for the Respect for Marriage Act that we had, a couple months ago, maybe. This is very important. I'm very happy. In fact, I'm ecstatic that they have finally done this. I had a real concern because there was no explanation. I kind of felt that there wasn't going to be an explanation to the church. The messaging at the time, and again, this comes from a very faithful perspective. Let's just keep that in mind here. But the messaging at the time was really very much outward, right? The PR messaging from the church newsroom, it was very outward facing. And there was no message to the members of the church. Here's the issue that I see with these things. And this is not to break anything down and undermine. So don't put that in the comments. It's simply commentary, okay? The problem I see with this, and that really concerned me at the time, was that I would get a lot of people contacting me because of our platform here, asking me what in the world is going on. First of all, the idea that does the church support gay marriage, and very confused on what all of this meant, because if you read the press release from the church, it is confusing. I mean, there is, of course, the first paragraph that covers the fact that the doctrine isn't changing, but the whole rest of it looks like it's very, very supportive, over and above supportive of gay marriage, etc. And so a number of people were contacting me, asking me, does the church support gay marriage now? And do we now go out and fight for gay marriage, right? Do we advocate for gay marriage in politics and everything else? What's going on? I had a lot of people from other countries contact me that follow the podcast, very conservative countries, right? The majority of the growth of the church comes from more family-centered, non-woke areas, such as the Philippines, Africa, South America, Latin America, etc. And they don't understand what's going on here in the U.S. that would have the church even be entertaining something like this. Right. So I had a lot of those questions. And so my concern at the time was, if we're not going to have messaging to the church, a lot of people are going to be very, very confused. And those that have had issues with where culture is going, especially in the U.S., toward critical social justice and identitarianism, is this going to confuse them enough that they're going to lose a testimony or decide they're not going to go to church for a while or not pay their tithe, whatever it is. And look, the argument that comes back often with something like this that has some merit to it, but that I don't fully like, is, look, we're in the time of the separation of the wheat and tares. And these are things that are going to help separate the wheat and tares. I that to me doesn't have a whole lot of charity to it. And I think that we have a responsibility, and the church has a responsibility in their messaging and their clarity on something so big. When you have dedicated your life to the church in callings, countless hours of labor and effort and concern for others, when you have paid tithing for years, maybe decades, right? And you have invested your emotions and your belief system into what the church represents. I think that something this large, not that there needs to be an explanation on every decision the church makes, and not that this is a democracy, it certainly is not. But on something this large, it seems to me like you need to have an explanation and clarity for the members of the church. And we'd been missing that until now, and where there was something clear from a leader of the church that tries to parse out through clear thinking, which that idea of the clear thinking I always attribute to President Oaks, about the Respect for Marriage Act. So with that, there's three things that I want to, like, I can look at the Respect for Marriage Act in three different ways, or at three different levels. The first is the Respect for Marriage Act itself. And we did a video on this, or an episode on this previously, talking more about the Respect for Marriage Act. But, you know, there's the idea of the act itself, the do you support it? Do you not support it? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Are you for it or are you against it? And we saw the differences here where you had Senator Romney of Utah who supported the Respect for Marriage Act, right? And then you had Senator Lee from Utah, that both members of the church, that did not support the Respect for Marriage Act. And the difference primarily, it's not just this easy, but the difference primarily was that Senator Romney had stated that he believes that the amendments that would be attached to this would be enough to really give more strength to the freedom of religion in going forward. And that's the main reason the church did this. And I think it's obviously the main reason the church did this, right? Senator Lee believed that while the amendments that were being put forward to the act would provide support, institutional support for freedom of religion, they did not offer it to the individual. And again, I'm just simplifying things here. And that this was not enough. And for him, it was not enough to support the bill, to put it through, without those additional amendments that focused on the individuals. Okay? What you're going to see here from President Oaks is that the reason they supported this was that they felt that it was something more, and they wanted more of the support for the freedom of religion. The press release was very confusing about all of this. But anyway, so that's one level, the act itself, right? Number two is, what about the church's involvement in the culture war, period? Whether it's legal or political, supporting Prop 8 in California back in 2008, you can think going back to the ERA in the 70s, the Equal Rights Amendment. The church rarely, outside of Utah, gets involved in politics. They're heavily involved in politics in Utah. But outside of Utah, they don't really, put a national effort behind organization and support for politics. Much, much less than other Christian denominations do. And I think that's the right approach. The question is, should they be involved in the culture war at all? Was Prop 8 the right thing to do? Was it worth it? When Babylon and the world is moving down a certain path and you're fighting against it as an institution, as the church, not you individually, but as an institution, is it worth fighting those political battles, or should the church be aimed specifically just at preaching the gospel, building and gathering Israel, and gathering Israel, building Zion, and crying repentance, right? So that's another level below that. It's like, okay, you got the act up here, then you've got, well, what should we be involved in the culture war? And then lastly is what I kind of already brought up before, is that I felt was so important, was the actual messaging to the church. So those are the three things I want to cover here in this episode. And what we're going to do is take the words of President Oaks in his clarifying speech earlier this week and just talk about this a little bit in a faithful manner, right? Faithful perspective on especially these three issues. Here we go. Now, if we go to the statement back on November 15th, 2022, when they talked about the support for the Respect for Marriage Act, this is what is given immediately, right? It's the first statement in the press release, right? It says, the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints related to marriage between a man and a woman is well known and will remain unchanged. The issue is beyond that. It gets it was not very well written, in my opinion. It doesn't clarify things about political movement toward this. Do we advocate for this? Does this mean we're advocating for this inside the church? It's very confusing, right? All right, back to President Oaks.
Marriage bills previously proposed in the Congress made no attempt to protect religious freedom. The church came out in favor of amendments that added religious freedom protections to the proposed Respect for Marriage Act. But its overall effect was misunderstood because many news stories focused only on the part of the act that affirmed same-sex marriage.
All right, let me just say here real quick, so did the PR statement. That's what's confusing, right? I know he's now messaging to the church, and messaging to the world maybe is different, but the PR statement, right? If you go back here to the PR statement, you have this one phrase up here, and then the rest, I'll read you the rest of this and what it said in the PR statement. We are grateful for the continuing efforts of those who work to ensure the Respect for Marriage Act includes appropriate religious freedom protections. That's what he's talking about, while respecting the law and preserving the rights of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Okay? That part I get. That to me is, I understand what he's saying there. We live in a pluralistic society, and there are rights that we may not agree with doctrinally, but we're going to respect those things. And in that case, he's actually saying, don't get involved with or the church is not going to get involved with, let's say, gay marriage, right? Very different from where we were before. Here's the third paragraph. We believe this approach is the way forward as we work together to preserve the principles and practices of religious freedom together with the rights of LGBTQ individuals. See, that's where people start to lose, I think, perspective on what he's trying to do here. Much can be accomplished to heal relationships and foster greater understanding. Okay. I think it's confusing. I just don't think that and I understand it's a very short press release, but I think that it's very confusing for people in trying to understand what the church is trying to accomplish with this. You have to really be invested and listen to a lot of what the President Oaks and Elder Christensen and Elder Cook, especially those three, have been working on for the last several years, decade or two. Even, at least it's since Prop 8, I would say, in trying to add rights to the LGBTQ individuals in the U.S. while supporting religious freedom. And again, you may not agree with it, but at least, I think at least the church needs the clarification on what they're doing. And at least we're getting that now from President Oaks.
The Respect for Marriage Act did restate same-sex marriage as the law of the land. But that added little because that law was already in effect under the U.S. Supreme Court's Obergefell decision.
Okay, so I don't know what he's going to say next, but just keep in mind here is to understand what he's saying, right, is that, okay, gay marriage is already the law of the land. Right? It already exists. So this doesn't add much. My question is then on the other side of that, where we're focused on the religious freedom side, and maybe he's going to say this right now, I don't know, but don't we already have that also? Does this add little with religious freedom in the First Amendment that we already have? Where have we seen so far a successful bid by those who would want to change religion? Not from the inside, not from change of culture, not from change of policies and procedures within a denomination, but from the government requiring same-sex marriage with that institution. Where have we seen that? I don't know that I've ever seen it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would just say, okay, well, it seems to me that we've already got that in the First Amendment. Maybe he's going to clarify that here.
The focus of the church's efforts was not on same-sex marriage, but on ensuring the act contained the necessary protections for religious freedom. As signed into law, the Respect for Marriage Act included valuable provisions to assure that no federal or state laws could be used to harm the religious or conscience rights of faith-based institutions or their members.
Okay.
In the end, the total law ensures that religious organizations, religious schools, and their staff
important
do not have to perform or host same-sex marriages or celebrations.
Okay. Now, so just so you know, right? I mean, there's two sides of this that I think are important. But for those of you that think that the church is moving toward a position of perhaps soon allowing same-sex marriage in the temple, what did you just hear him say? Whether you agree with whether this helps or not, what he is saying is we are trying to help ensure that we are able to do what we want with our temples, at our institutions, at the universities, so that we can comply with the commandments of the Lord and with the doctrine of the church, right? So look at that. Please look at that clearly on this. The support for this has nothing to do with supporting same-sex marriage within the church. It does support same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights pluralistically in a pluralistic society under the law in our country, but not within the church. It's the exact opposite. What he's exactly doing is protecting it outside of the church and at the same time protecting against it inside of the church. Does that make sense? So those that have thought that, well, we're moving down there, we're inching down toward same-sex marriage within the church, that isn't true. That's just not true. That's not what he's doing. That's not what the leaders are doing. It's in fact the exact opposite. Now, whether or not the Respect for Marriage Act will provide that additional protection, well, that remains to be seen, right? I don't know enough about that. I am not a legal expert. But I hope we can clarify that, what he's talking about, those two things. That I clearly understand. What are his intentions? That's important to know. And I think we see that here. All right, so some clarifying words there. It didn't go into a whole lot. I just wish that there was more, right? I wish there was more clarity on these things and a clear understanding of how we're operating with this. I mean, this to me is something that is big enough that there ought to be an outline put together and maybe sent out to Sunday school, or if not Sunday school, then to Elders Quorum and Relief Society for a week's, maybe a fifth Sunday or something to talk about this. Now, would they ever do that? No, they're never going to do that because it's such a whirlwind. We're still I think in the church in a position where they're not wanting to rock the boat too much on these issues. And I don't know how long they'll be able to hold off with that as these pressures become greater and greater. But wouldn't that be nice? Or a stake fireside to cover these things and explain what's going on. That's why we're moving into a time right now where it's very, very difficult. The messaging of the church is going to become more and more difficult until they finally get to a point where they're like, it's all out repentance, right? It's all out. Babylon has been lost. But right now they don't really talk much about those things, as you've probably noticed. And I suppose there is some wisdom in that, but if there's wisdom in that, there is also confusion that can be brought to the members. And that means that we need to stick further to the scriptures and to doctrine and to become a little more independent and strengthened in our testimonies. and understanding of the principles of the gospel. Because without that, as we've learned from President Nelson recently, without the Spirit and without a clear understanding of the gospel, which many of us don't fully have because we haven't spent the time really studying the scriptures, really digging in. Without that, it's going to be hard. This is the times I think are going to be very hard because there's a certain type of management of messaging right now that is requiring us to dig in and to start lifting spiritual weights, so to speak, so that we can strengthen ourselves. Thanks for listening.